He didn't fight back. He didn't even raise his hands. And that single choice was about to bring an entire town to its knees. The bell above the door of Meadow Creek Diner gave its usual tired jingle at 7:14 that Tuesday morning, and nobody looked up. Virgil Atwood liked it that way. At 72, he had learned that the quietest tables were the sweet ones, a corner booth by the window, a cup of black coffee, and the Sunday paper even on a Tuesday, because habits didn't need permission to repeat themselves. He wore the same faded green jacket he always wore, the one with a small anchor pin on the collar that most people never noticed and he never explained. 40 years ago, that pin had meant something to men who trusted him with their lives on a destroyer, in waters most Americans couldn't find on a map. Now it just kept his collar from flapping in the wind. Doreen, the waitress who'd worked the counter for 11 years, poured his coffee without being asked. Morning, Virgil. The usual. You know me too well, Doreen. Eggs over easy wheat toast, no home fries because your doctor scared you straight. She winked and walked off, and for a moment the diner was exactly what Virgil needed it to be. Small, warm, unremarkable. That piece lasted 6 minutes. The door opened again, harder this time, and the bell nearly leapt off its hook. Colton Briggs walked in like he owned the floorboards, because in a way he did. His family's name sat on the town's biggest construction company, on 2 apartment complexes, on a plaque outside the community center that nobody had asked him to fund, but that he made sure everyone saw anyway. He was 44, broad-shouldered, dressed in a blazer too sharp for a diner at 7 in the morning, and trailed by 2 men who laughed at things before he'd finished saying them. He didn't order. He looked for something to be unhappy about, the way some men look for parking spots. His eyes landed on Virgil's booth, the corner booth, the good one, the one Colton apparently believed belonged to him whenever he wanted it. "That's my table," Colton said, loud enough for the whole diner to hear, though it wasn't a question, and it wasn't really addressed to Virgil at all. It was addressed to the room, a performance. Virgil looked up slowly, the way a man does when he's decided nothing about his morning has changed. "Didn't see your name on it," he said, not unkindly. A ripple of laughter went through the diner. Quiet, quickly swallowed, but real. And that was the mistake. Colton Briggs did not tolerate being laughed at, especially not by a stranger in a jacket that looked like it came from a thrift store, especially not in front of an audience. "You think this is funny, old man?" "I think it's a diner," Virgil said. "There's room for both of us." Colton stepped closer, close enough that Doreen froze behind the counter with the coffee pot still in her hand. "You don't know who I am." "I know exactly who you are," Virgil said, and something in his voice had shifted. Not fear, not anger, just a terrible, calm clarity. The tone of a man who had faced down worse than a loudmouth in an expensive blazer and had no intention performing for anyone. "You're a man who needs a room full of strangers to feel important." The silence that followed was the kind that is weight. You could feel it pressing on the windows. Colton's face went red, then white, then red again. His hand shot out and grabbed Virgil's jacket collar, yanking him half out of the booth. Coffee spilled across the table, onto Virgil's newspaper, onto the floor. "Say that again," Colton hissed. Virgil didn't. He didn't say anything at all. He simply looked at the younger man with a steadiness that seemed to make Colton angrier, as if Virgil's calm was itself an insult, as if the old man's refusal to be afraid was the one thing Colton Briggs could not stand to lose to. That's when it happened. The shove that sent Virgil stumbling backward into a chair, and then to the floor, his hip cracking against the tile hard enough that a woman near the register gasped out loud and immediately covered her own mouth as if she'd done something wrong just by reacting. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. Not Doreen, not the 2 men who'd walked in with Colton, who suddenly found their phones very interesting, not the trucker in booth who had, 20 minutes earlier, told his buddy on the phone that somebody ought to knock that Briggs kid down a peg someday. Not the young mother with a toddler in a high chair, who pulled her son's face gently toward her shoulder, so he wouldn't see what came next. Not the retired schoolteacher by the door, who had taught half the town's population at some point in her life, and had certainly taught better than this. Virgil lay on the floor of the diner where he'd eaten breakfast every Tuesday for 6 years, and the room stayed silent. He didn't cry out. He pressed one hand flat against the cool tile, gathered whatever remained of his composure, and began, slowly, the long process of getting himself back up. Because if there was one thing 72 years and one war and one heartbreak of a career had taught Virgil Atwood, it was that a man's dignity was never about whether he fell. It was about what he did afterward. And what Virgil did next. One quiet phone call from the diner's parking lot, made with hands that would not stop shaking no matter how calm his voice remained, was about to turn Colton Briggs's very good morning into the worst day of his entire life. Nobody in that diner knew it yet. But the phone call Virgil Atwood was about to make would bring the full weight of the federal government to a two-lane road in the middle of nowhere, and not one of them would ever forget the sound of the convoy pulling in. Virgil pushed himself up off the floor using the edge of the booth, his knees cracking in protest. His hip already throbbing in a way he knew from experience would turn into a deep purple bruise by nightfall. Nobody offered a hand. He didn't ask for one. Colton Briggs stood over him, chest heaving, looking less like a man who'd won something and more like a man who had just realized, somewhere in the back of his mind, that he'd crossed a line he couldn't see the other side of. But pride is a stubborn animal, and instead of backing down, he doubled down. Somebody should call the deputy, Colton announced to the room, straightening his blazer as though he were the aggrieved party. This man assaulted me. That was the second lie he told that morning, and like the first, that the booth belonged to him. Nobody in the diner corrected it out loud. Deputy Hal Rennick arrived 9 minutes later, unhurried, coffee of his own already in hand from the gas station down the road. He was younger than Colton, but he'd grown up 2 streets over from the Briggs family's first apartment complex, and everybody in town knew Hal's cousin worked construction for Colton's company. Hal took one look at the scene. Virgil still holding the edge of the booth, his shirt untucked, coffee stains spreading across the floor, and one look at Colton, blazer straightened, voice steady and confident, and made his decision before he'd asked a single question. "Sir," Hal said to Virgil, not unkindly, but with the flat, dismissive tone people use on someone they've already decided doesn't matter, "maybe it's best you head on home. Let's not make more of this than it needs to be." "He assaulted me," Virgil said quietly, in front of everyone. "I didn't see anything happen," Hal said, glancing around the room. "Anybody see anything?" The silence stretched again. Durian's grip tightened on the coffee pot. The trucker in booth 4 looked hard at his eggs. The retired schoolteacher's mouth opened slightly, then closed. Even the young mother, cradling her toddler, found something urgent to examine in her diaper bag. Not one person spoke. Virgil looked around that room slowly, meeting eyes that dropped away the moment they met his, and something in his chest hollowed out that was worse, in its own way, than the fall itself. He had spent 4 decades of his life believing in the idea that ordinary people, given the chance, would do the right thing. Today, an entire diner full of ordinary people had shown him otherwise. "All right," Virgil said, and there was no bitterness in it, only a terrible, tired understanding. "All right." He gathered his jacket, left $3 on the table for coffee he never finished, and walked out past Colton without a glance, past the deputy without a word, into the gray light of the parking lot where his old truck sat waiting. He didn't drive off right away. He sat behind the wheel for a long moment, hands resting on his knees, breathing slowly the way he'd been taught to do decades ago, when the deck beneath his feet was pitching in rough water, and panic was a luxury no sailor could afford. Then he reached for the phone in his jacket pocket. He scrolled to a single contact he rarely used, not because he didn't love the man on the other end, but because he made a point never to lean on him. Virgil Atwood had never once, in 30 years, called his son for help with anything that could be handled alone. The phone rang twice. "Dad." Terrence Atwood's voice came through immediately, sharp with the instinct of a son who knew his father didn't call at 7:40 in the morning without reason. "Dad, what's wrong?" Virgil closed his eyes. "I'm fine, son. Banged up a little. Nothing that won't heal." "Banged up how? What happened?" There was a pause. The kind of pause where a proud man decides, against every instinct he has, to actually answer question. "There's a fella here who thinks this town belongs to him. Decided I needed reminding I don't belong in his diner. Knocked me down in front of a full room, and not a single person lifted a finger. The deputy told me to go home like I was the one who'd done something wrong." Terrence didn't respond right away. Virgil could hear him breathing on the other end. Could hear, faintly, The click of a laptop being closed, papers being set down, a chair rolling back from a desk somewhere 300 miles away in an office with Federal seal on the door. "What's the name of the diner?" Terrence finally said. His voice had changed. Gone was the worry. In its place was something colder, more precise. The voice of a man used to being obeyed, used to making calls that moved other people into motion. "Terrence, I don't want any trouble. I just wanted you to hear it from me before." "Dad, what's the name of the diner?" Virgil told him. "Meadow Creek Diner. Route 9, the only one in town. Stay in your truck," Terrence said. "Don't go back inside. Don't say anything else to anyone. I'm sending people your way, and then I'm coming myself. Son, you don't need to make a whole—" "Dad." Terrence's voice cracked. Just slightly, just once, betraying the fear underneath the authority. Somebody put their hands on you, in public, and a room full of people watched and said nothing, and a man wearing a badge told you to walk away like you were the problem. I am not going to sit at my desk and pretend that's acceptable. I love you. Stay put. The line went dead. Virgil sat in his truck in the diner's parking lot, staring through the windshield at the building where he'd just been humiliated, and for the first time all morning, felt something other than shame settle into his chest. He had no idea, sitting there with his bruised hip and his torn dignity, just how fast the world was about to change, or that within the hour, 3 black SUVs with government plates would turn off Route 9 and into that gravel lot, carrying men who did not knock before they walked through doors. The gravel lot outside Meadow Creek Diner had never seen anything like it. 3 black SUVs rolling in with the kind of quiet, deliberate authority that made even the birds go still, and every single person inside was about to learn exactly whose father they had watched fall to floor. Colton Briggs was still holding court when the vehicles pulled in. He'd ordered a fresh coffee, laughed off the incident to his 2 friends as some old man who needed to learn his place, and was in the middle of telling Deputy Rennick that the whole matter was closed as far as he was concerned, when Doreen looked out the window and went very quiet. "Colton," she said, "you might want to see this." He turned, expecting nothing, and found himself looking at 3 matte black SUVs arranged in a loose semicircle around the parking lot's entrance, blocking any easy way out. Men in dark suits stepped from the first 2 vehicles with the unhurried precision of people who had done this before, fanning out along the front of the building without a word passing between them. No lights, no sirens, just an overwhelming, silent certainty that something serious had arrived. The bell above the door rang, and this time everybody looked up. Terrence Atwood walked in first. He was 51 years old, built like his father had been 30 years earlier, with the same steady eyes and the same refusal to raise his voice unless the moment demanded it. He wore no uniform, just a charcoal suit, no tie, sleeves still creased from the flight he'd taken the moment he'd hung up the phone with his father. But the badge clipped to his belt, and the 2 agents flanking him made his position unmistakable to anyone who'd ever watched the news. His eyes swept the room once, found his father sitting quietly in a booth near the door where he'd been waiting exactly as instructed, and something in Terrence's jaw tightened before he even said a word. "Dad," he said, crossing the room in 4 long strides and crouching beside the booth, taking Virgil's hands as his own, checking his face, his collar, the way his shirt had been pulled askew. "Are you all right? Do you need a doctor?" "I'm all right, son," Virgil said quietly, though the tremor in his voice betrayed just how much the last hour had cost him. "It's not as bad as it looked." It looked bad enough that a room full of adults watched it happen and did nothing, Terrence said, loud enough now for the whole diner to hear, and he stood, turning slowly to take in the room. The trucker in booth 4 who suddenly found his coffee fascinating, the retired teacher near the door, Doreen frozen behind the counter, Deputy Rennick standing near the register with his thumbs hooked in his belt, as though trying to look more relaxed than he felt, and Colton Briggs, coffee cup still in hand, blazer still sharp, confidence draining out of him by the second. "Who is in charge here?" Terrence said. It wasn't really a question. "I—" Deputy Rennick started. "I responded to the call. There wasn't really anything to charge, sir. It was just a disagreement that got a little—" "A disagreement," Terrence repeated slowly, "that left a 72-year-old man on the floor of this diner. A disagreement you responded to by telling the victim to go home." He let that sit in the air. "What's your name, deputy?" "Rennick." How Rennick? Mr. Rennick, I want you to understand something, because I don't think you fully do yet. My name is Terrence Atwood. I serve as a senior official with the Department of Homeland Security, and the man you told to walk away this morning is my father, a retired chief petty officer who served this country for over 30 years, on ships and in places most people in this room couldn't find on a map, so that towns exactly like this one could stay peaceful enough for men like you grow up in them without ever knowing the cost. The room had gone utterly silent. Even Colton's two friends, who moments earlier had been snickering behind their phones, had gone pale and still. I'm not here to make a scene, Terrence continued, his voice dropping, becoming almost gentle, which somehow made it more unsettling than if he'd shouted. I'm not here for revenge. I'm here because my father called me from a parking lot with his hands shaking, and I made him a promise a long time ago that if anyone ever hurt him and the people responsible for protecting him looked the other way, I would come myself. So here I am. He turned toward Colton, who had set his coffee cup down at some point without seeming to notice, both hands now visible and open at his sides in a universal, unconscious posture of a man trying to appear harmless after being caught doing the opposite. You must be the one who put your hands on my father, Terrence said. It wasn't like that, Colton said quickly, and his voice, the same voice that had commanded the room 20 minutes earlier, had lost every ounce of its swagger. It was a misunderstanding. He said something, and I reacted, and... He sat in a booth, Terrence said. You told him it was your table. He didn't move fast enough for your liking. So you put your hands on a man 40 years your senior and threw him to the floor in front of witnesses, and then you told the responding officer that he assaulted you. Terrence's eyes hadn't left Colton's face the entire time. Does that sound about right so far? Colton said nothing. There's a security camera above the register, Terrence said, nodding toward the small black dome mounted near the ceiling that most people in the diner had walked beneath 1,000 times without noticing. I imagine it's still recording. I imagine it captured every second of what happened here. And I imagine, Mr. Briggs, that within the hour, everyone in this room was going to have a very different story to tell than the one they were prepared to stay silent about. For the first time since Colton Briggs had walked through that door that morning like he owned the floorboards, he looked unmistakably afraid. The moment the security footage started playing on Doreen's laptop at the counter, something broke loose in that diner. It wasn't just Colton Briggs's confidence. It was the silence itself, cracking open all at once like ice giving way on a spring lake. Pull it up, Terrence said, and Doreen, hands still trembling slightly, typed in the password to the diner's ancient security system and turned the laptop screen toward the room. There, in grainy but unmistakable footage time-stamped 7:20 that morning, was a whole sequence exactly as Virgil had described it. Colton walking in, Colton pointing at the booth, Colton's hand closing around Virgil's collar, the shove, the fall, and then the part that made even Deputy Rennick's face go slack. 20 full seconds of the diner full of people simply watching, not one of them moving to help, not one of them speaking up, while an old man lay on the floor holding his hip. There it is, Terrence said quietly, not gloating, just stating a fact into a room that badly needed to hear it stated. Every second of it. Colton's mouth opened, then closed. His two friends had already begun inching toward the door, and one of the federal agents near the entrance simply looked at them, saying nothing, and they froze in place like they'd walked into an invisible wall. It was a retired schoolteacher who spoke first. Her name was Margaret Voss, and she had taught 3rd grade in that town for 31 years, taught half the adults in that very diner their multiplication tables and their manners, and something about watching Virgil crumble on that screen seemed to break something open in her that guilt alone hadn't managed. I saw it, she said, her voice shaking but clear. I saw the whole thing. I didn't say anything because I was scared of him. She nodded toward Colton without looking at him. His company employs half this town. My nephew works construction for him. I was afraid if I said something, it would come back on my family. Thank you, Terrence said simply, and something in his voice, not triumph, just quiet gratitude, seemed to give the room permission to keep going. The trucker and Booth cleared his throat next, a big man named Dale Pruitt who hauled lumber for a living and spent the last 20 minutes silently ashamed of himself. I saw it too. He grabbed him first. Old man never raised a hand. Dale looked at Colton directly now. You've been strutting around this town like you own it for 5 years, and everybody's too scared of losing work to say a word. Well, I don't work for you, so I got nothing to lose saying it now. You're a bully. Always have been. One by one. Like a dam finally giving way after holding back more pressure than it was built for, the room found its voice. The young mother admitted she'd turned her son's face away not because she hadn't seen, but because she hadn't known what to do and was ashamed of it now. Even one of Colton's own friends, a thin, nervous man named Petey Duran, mumbled that he'd told Colton more than once he needed to cool it and hadn't been listened to. Deputy Hal Rennick stood very still through all of it, watching the footage loop a second time, his face growing paler with each replay. When it finished, Terrence turned to him. Deputy Rennick, I'd like you to explain to me, on the record, why you told the victim of an assault to leave the scene rather than taking a statement, reviewing available footage, or filing a report. Hal swallowed. Sir, I know the Briggs family. Colton's cousin. We grew up together. I didn't think. You didn't think, Terrence repeated. Or you didn't want the complication of holding a powerful man in this town accountable. So you decided the easier path was to make the problem disappear by sending my father home with a bruised hip and no one held responsible. I'm sorry, Hal said, and he meant it, the shame playing on his face. That's exactly what I did. I'm sorry. Terrence didn't respond to that immediately. He turned instead to Colton Briggs, who had backed himself against the counter, all the swagger gone out of him, looking, for first time that morning, like exactly what he was, a man who had built a small kingdom out of other people's fear and had just watched it collapse in under 10 minutes. Mr. Briggs, Terrence said, I could have you charged with assault this morning. I could make a phone call right now and have federal and local resources make the next several months of your life very difficult. And given what that footage shows, no jury in this state would hesitate. You put your hands on a 72-year-old veteran in public and then lied to a police officer about it. Colton's throat worked. I'm not finished, Terrence said, quiet as ever, and the room stayed silent to hear him. But this isn't actually about you, Mr. Briggs. This is about my father, who spent 30 years of his life on ships and waters most of the people in this room will never sail, doing a job that asked him to give up his safety so towns like this one could stay peaceful, and who came home to a diner where a bully could throw him to the ground and an entire room would just watch. He turned and for the first time looked back at his father, still sitting quietly in the booth, hands folded, watching his son with an expression that was equal parts pride, exhaustion, and something gentler underneath both. So before I decide what happens to you, Terrence said, turning back to Colton, I'm going to ask my father what he wants to happen, because it was never really my call to begin with. Every eye in the diner turned to a 72-year-old man in a faded green jacket, waiting to hear whether he would ask for justice or for mercy, and what Virgil Atwood said next would silence that room even more completely than the assault itself had. Virgil rose slowly from the booth, one hand braced against the table, his hips still aching, and walked to the center of the diner where his son stood beside Colton Briggs. The room watched him the way people watch something they don't yet understand but sense is important. Son, Virgil said, may I speak? Of course, Dad. This is your call, not mine. Virgil turned to face Colton, directly for the first time since the fall. Up close, without the bravado, Colton looked younger than his 44 years, and more frightened than a man his size and station had any business looking in a small-town diner. You knocked me down, Virgil said, in front of people I've shared a meal with for 6 years. You lied about it to an officer of the law. And for 20 seconds, this room let it happen, because they were more afraid of losing something from you than they were ashamed of doing nothing. He paused. That's the truth of this morning, and nothing that happens next changes it. Colton's jaw tightened, his eyes dropping to the floor. But I've spent 40 years of my life around men who made mistakes, Virgil continued. I served with plenty of them. Watched some of them nearly get themselves killed by their own pride, same as yours nearly got you in real trouble today. And I learned a long time ago that the difference between a man who stays a bully his whole life and a man who becomes something better usually comes down to one moment. Whether somebody makes him face what he did, or whether everybody just lets him keep going because it's easier. He looked at his son. I don't want him locked up, Terrence. A ripple went through the room, surprise mostly, and in a few faces, visible relief. Dad, Terrence said carefully, "He assaulted you. On camera. In front of witnesses. You don't have to protect him." "I'm not protecting him," Virgil said. "I'm not interested in revenge, and I never called you looking for it. I called you because I needed my son to know what happened to me, and because this town needed to see, just once, that silence has a cost and cowardice gets noticed eventually. That's happened now. Everyone in this room just watched a bully get caught, and watched themselves get caught alongside him. That's worth more to this town long term than watching this man spend a few nights in a cell." He turned back to Colton. "But there are conditions if you're willing to hear them, and if my son is willing to let a father handle this his own way instead of the government's way." Terrence, after a long moment, nodded once. "It's your call, Dad. I already said that." Virgil looked at Colton steadily. "First, you're going to apologize to me, not because a federal official is standing in this room, but because it's a decent thing to do, and I want to see whether you're capable of it without an audience forcing your hand." Colton's throat worked. He looked briefly at his two friends near the door, then back at Virgil, and something in his face shifted. Not performance this time, but something closer to genuine shame breaking through years of armor. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, and for once his voice carried none of its usual command. "I had no right to touch you. I've been treating this whole town like it owes me something for years, and I never once had an answer for it until right now. I'm sorry, Mr. Atwood. Truly." "Second," Virgil continued, "you're going to make this right with Deputy Rennick's department by supporting an independent review of how complaints against powerful people in this town get handled. Because what happened to me today has probably happened to plenty of people with less means to call for help than I had." Deputy Rennick, still standing near the register, looked down at his boots, nodding slowly, accepting the words as a correction they were. "And third," Virgil said, his voice softening slightly, "you ever spend some time figuring out why a man with as much as you has still needed a diner full of strangers to feel powerful? Because that's not a legal problem, Mr. Briggs. That's a hole in you that money never filled and never will. And throwing an old man to the floor isn't going to fill it either." The diner was utterly silent. The kind of silence that comes not from fear this time, but from everyone in the room recognizing they just witnessed something they hadn't expected. An old man, freshly humiliated and still in pain, choosing to hand out a harder kind of justice than handcuffs would have offered. Colton nodded, unable to speak, his eyes glistening in a way his two friends had certainly never seen before. Terrence studied his father for a long moment, something like awe passing behind his eyes, and then addressed the room one final time. "The footage stays on file in my office as a matter of record, in case anyone here is ever tempted to forget what accountability looks like. But my father has spoken, and I trust his judgment more than I trust my own anger this morning." He looked at Deputy Rennick. "I expect a full written report on my desk by Friday, along with the name of whoever handles internal reviews for this county." "Yes, sir," Hal said immediately, as the agents began filing back out to the SUVs, and the room slowly exhaled into the low murmur of a town realizing the crisis had passed without becoming a tragedy. Doreen came around the counter with a fresh cup of coffee and set it gently in front of Virgil's usual booth. "On the house," she said, her eyes wet. "For every Tuesday you've got left in this town, Virgil. I promise you that." 6 months later, the same diner bell rang above the same door, but the man who walked in this time was not the man who had walked out that morning, and what had become surprised the entire town all over again. News of what happened at Meadow Creek Diner spread to the town within days, and then, as these things do now, well beyond it, someone had leaked a portion of security footage, blurred, without names, to a local news outlet, and within a week the story of the veteran, the bully, and the DHS official had made its way onto a handful of regional broadcasts. Reporters called Terrence's office for comment. He declined every request, saying only that the matter had been resolved privately and appropriately by the person it actually happened to. Virgil hated the attention. He turned down 2 interview requests a week for a month before people finally stopped calling. And he told Doreen more than once that he wished the whole thing had just stayed inside the diner's 4 walls. But quietly, without cameras, something had shifted in the town that no news segment could have captured. Deputy Rennick made good on the promise Terrence had extracted from him. The county sheriff department opened an internal review of how complaints involving prominent local business owners had been handled over the previous decade, and 2 older, buried complaints, filed by people with far less standing than Virgil Atwood, were finally reopened. How Rennick, to his credit, became one of the loudest voices pushing for review, as if trying to outrun the shame of that morning by becoming the kind of officer he should have been from the start. Margaret Voss, the retired teacher, started attending town council meetings again after a long absence, no longer content to stay quiet when she saw something wrong. She said once to Doreen, over coffee, that watching herself freeze on that laptop screen had taught her more about courage than 31 years of teaching civics ever had. And Colton Briggs, the man who had walked through that door believing the whole town owed him deference simply for existing, disappeared from the diner for nearly 2 months. Rumors swirled that he'd left town for good, that shame had finally done what no lawsuit ever could. But on a quiet Tuesday morning in early autumn, the bell above the door rang, and Colton Briggs walked in alone, no blazer, no entourage, dressed like anyone else headed to work. He didn't look for a table to claim. He walked straight to the corner booth by the window, where Virgil Atwood sat exactly where he always sat. Coffee in front of him, the Sunday paper open even though it was Tuesday. "Mind if I sit?" Colton asked, and there was nothing left of his voice of the man who'd once announced his presence to a room like an entitlement. Virgil studied him for a long moment, then gestured to the seat across from him. "Room enough for 2, he said, echoing, without either of them quite realizing it, the very words that started everything 6 months earlier. They didn't talk about that morning at first. Colton mentioned that he'd started volunteering at the community center his own family's name was bolted at the front of, actually showing up now, actually working, instead of just funding a plaque. He mentioned, awkwardly, that he'd started seeing a counselor, something he never imagined himself admitting out loud to anyone, let alone the man he'd once thrown to the floor. "I keep thinking about what you said," Colton admitted eventually, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table, "about the whole money never filled. I didn't understand it that morning. I think I'm starting to." Virgil nodded slowly. "Understanding it is the hard part. Everything after that just takes time." "Why didn't you want me punished?" Colton asked. "You had every right." Virgil considered the question the way he considered most things, carefully, without rushing toward an easy answer. "Because I spent 30 years learning that punishing a man rarely changes him. It just teaches him to hide better next time. But shame him gently, in front of people whose respect he actually wants, and give him a chance to become something different. Sometimes that works. Not always, but sometimes." He took a sip of his coffee. "Looks like this might have been one of the times." Colton didn't say anything for a moment, just looked down at the table. And when he looked back up, his eyes were wet in a way that would have been unthinkable to a man who'd walked in 6 months ago. "Thank you," he said simply, "for not letting me stay who I was." Word of that quiet breakfast never made the news. There was no camera in the room to capture it, no federal convoy in the parking lot, no crowd holding its breath. It was just 2 men at a small table in a small-town diner, working through the slow and unglamorous business of becoming better than the worst moment either of them had ever had. Doreen, watching from behind the counter as she had that first terrible morning, refilled both of their cups without being asked, and said nothing at all, because for once, the silence in that diner wasn't the kind anybody needed to be ashamed of. Evil grows loudest in rooms where good people decide silence is safer than truth. But courage, once spoken, even quietly, even by a single voice in a crowded room, has a way of finding every corner it's needed in. Virgil Atwood never asked to be a lesson to anyone. He simply refused, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, to let humiliation take his dignity along with it. The real question was never about Colton Briggs, or Deputy Rennick, or the diner full of people who looked away. It was about every person reading this, watching this, listening to this, and whether, the next time silence feels like the safer choice, they'll remember the sound of an old man hitting the floor and the sound, just as important, of the room that finally, eventually, found its voice.